job of covering a capital, there are really certain basic assumptions you have to operate on. The first is that every government is run by liars, and nothing proven to the contrary. And secondly, a government always, if you take the trouble to really study what it says.
On January 17, 1953, the first issue of I.F. Stone's Weekly appeared. Circulation, 5,300.
Got these two lines here. If you want to add two more here, knock out two here. Right.
McCarthyism was at its height, and Stone was a blacklisted newspaperman whose career seemed at an end. But if there remained no papers he could write for, he would start his own. He began as the researcher, writer, editor, publisher, and proofreader, and he remained all of these for 19 years.
I'll tell you one story, if I may, if you're interested. It really is the story of the best scoop I ever got and how I got it. You know, this whole terrible underground testing miasma really began in the mind of that scientific screwball and real nut, Edward Taylor. Because as we got close to an agreement with the Russians, he began to say, well, suppose they test underground, or suppose they test 50,000 miles out in space. How will you know? How will you know? And the first underground test was held by the Teller crowd in order to show the possibility of hiding testing underground. And in the fall of 1967, they held the first test out in Nevada. And I wasn't out there, but I got the Times the next morning. Gladwin Hill wrote the story. And it said that the results seemed to conform to the expectation of the experts, meaning Teller and Latter and people like that, that the test would not be detectable more than 200 miles away. But the city edition I got at home had a shirt tail from Toronto saying that Toronto had detected it. I went downtown and bought the late city, and there were little shirt tails, one from Rome and one from Tokyo, saying they detected it. I thought, gee, I wish I had enough money to cable those places and find out what's going on. I didn't know what to do with it. And I put it down in the basement with all my back numbers of the Times and waited. And then the following spring, on a Tuesday, Harold Stassen, who was Eisenhower's negotiator with the Russians on a test ban agreement, testified before the Humphrey Subcommittee on Disarmament that the Russians were prepared to agree to permit listening posts, scientific listening posts, every 1,000 kilometers across the Soviet Union. That is about, what is it, 5/8 of a mile, about 580 miles apart. And it looked like a real breakthrough for a comprehensive test ban. 2 days later, the Atomic Energy Commission, which is, in my opinion, the most mendacious government agency in Washington, all back to the days when they told us that fallout was good for you, released to the press for publication the following Monday the first official scientific report on the first underground test. And in it, they said that the test could not be detected more than 200 miles away. No mention was made of Stassen. The obvious purpose was to make a liar out of Stassen and undercut that agreement. When I saw it, I went down the basement, dug out that old Times, and I called the AEC press office. There were some nice guys in there. And I said, how do you guys reconcile your new report with the fact that the Times, the morning after, reported that Toronto, Tokyo, and Rome had detected on their seismometers? And the guy said, well, Izzy, I don't know what to tell you. We'll try to see what we can find out from Nevada. I'll let you know later. So he said, I'll call you back. So I thought, I'd never been on a seismology story before. I thought, where the hell can I find a seismologist? I began to phone around town. I discovered that the Department of Commerce had a Coast and Geodetic Survey, and the Coast and Geodetic Survey had a seismology branch. So I jumped in the car, went down there, and they were so glad to see a reporter. I don't think they'd seen a reporter since it was a tremble from Mount Ararat when Noah's Ark landed, and there was a wide squiggle on the seismometer. And I said to them, I'm studying this underground test, and do you think it's true that Toronto, Tokyo, and Rome detected it? And they said, no, we don't think so. And they showed me how to read a seismometer. It wasn't too easy to read, you know, all the different. They said, we don't think so. But they said, here are 19 of our stations that we know did detect it with certainty. And here are the distances. So I said, do you mind if I copy it down? I said, oh, no, go ahead. So I copied down the 19. And one of them was 1,200 miles to the east of Nevada in Fayetteville, Arkansas. And one was 2,600 miles to the north in Fairbanks, Alaska. And they said, why are you so interested? I said, well, the AEC has just given us a report for publication next Monday saying that they couldn't be detected more than 200 miles away. So when they heard that, they realized they were going to get caught in some kind of bureaucratic snafu, so they clammed up on me. When I got back to the office, the AEC called and said, Izzy, we heard you were just down at Coast and Geodetic Survey. We've got Nevada on the teletype, but it's too late out there by now. It's late afternoon to get the information down tomorrow. So sure enough, tomorrow, they gave me a correction. But they didn't give it to anybody else except my friend Dick Dudman of the Post-Dispatch, whom I let in on the story. And every other paper still had the original report with the original lie in it, undercutting Stassen. It took about 3 weeks before Senator Clinton Anderson had a special hearing of the Joint Atomic Committee, which was much better than it is today. And this was my great moment, said to Admiral Scroggs, wasn't it I.F. Stone's story that made you admit that this wasn't true?
Well, what's a journalist supposed to do when he is given information by someone in Washington that they sort of want printed, but they don't want to attribute it to them? What do you call that?
Well, please use, but don't attribute. All these private briefings are very bad because they take the reporter into the family. And once you've had dinner with Secretary of State and he's asked your opinion about a complex problem and you've told him what they ought to do, you feel like a statesman, and you're a close friend, and you wouldn't think of criticizing the great man. And you understand there's certain things the public ought not to know. Better for them not to know. Really better for them not to know. Now, you know, you always pay something for everything you got. There's always an asset and a liability. The establishment reporters, without a doubt, know a lot of things I don't know. But a lot of what they know isn't true. And a lot of what they know that is true, they can't print. But if you're one of the crowd, and a respectable fellow, and a solid fellow, and an up-and-coming fellow, you find yourself at dinner parties agreeing with people, and a lot of half-baked nonsense. You shake your head very wisely, and people see you shaking your head wisely, and they figure you're a very wise guy, you're going to go far. And pretty soon, you know, you're just caught up in the goddamnest mess of crap anybody ever got caught up in. Now, as far as the media go, especially TV and radio, the basic purpose of the media is merchandising. The news is something in between the ads and the commercials. And if you're a salesman, you don't want to get this customer sore by discussing politics. You discuss the weather. So there's a tendency to be bland.
JDL, and that should be one.
Now, yeah, it is, but if it doesn't make page one,
then it should
then
go
you want to
on
make it
the main to the front. It should go on the front.
We had two of the three cases of these child
This
killings.
is the third.
This is the third, so that's why we killed the third. But the other two we've had. All right.
Smut.
For most of those 19 years, Stone was an outcast. His opposition to the loyalty purges of the 50s made him untouchable in Washington. Even old friends stayed away. Working alone at home, amid official transcripts and newspaper clippings, the only sources available to him, he swooped down weekly against the Cold War, the military, the arms race, the suppression of civil liberties, Eisenhower's callousness to the civil rights movement. Slowly, via the Vietnam War, the country caught up with him. This crew from National Educational Television traveled to Washington in late 1971 to tape a half-hour program. By then, the weekly had a circulation of more than 70,000. It reached into many of the nooks and crannies of official Washington and had gained a reputation far beyond the Capitol. To his readers, he was the accountant who took apart the federal budget every year, the engineer who unraveled the meaning of advances in weapons technology, the master of invective who could put a president in his place. He was their personal correspondent in Washington. he could make sense of the news.
What I suspected about Tonkin Gulf, and what I showed in my little paper within a week, anybody else in town could have done.
You see, that's, again,
Anybody else could have done. All you had to do was to first read the wire services very carefully, then read very carefully the testimony taken by the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, then begin asking a few more questions, look a little bit further, and it was very clear that something serious was amiss.
Aggression, deliberate, willful, and systematic aggression has unmasked its face to the entire world. The world remembers. The world must never forget that aggression unchallenged is aggression unleashed.
On the night of August 4, 1964, 2 American destroyers were reported attacked by North Vietnamese PT boats, which were promptly sunk. We know now that this attack, if it was an attack, was provoked by a campaign of bombing and sabotage initiated in secret 6 months earlier. But at the time, the event was treated as another Pearl Harbor. Reason to begin bombing North Vietnam, destroying oil depots and half of its tiny navy. A previously planned strategy of injured innocents is put into effect.
Let me repeat that these vessels took no belligerent action of any kind until they were subject to armed attack. And let me say once more.
And at home, the story is accepted without question.
if we let them get away with this, they'll start someplace else.
Johnson uses the furor to obtain a blank check for his war from the Congress.
We will open on the seal for 30 seconds. Yes. My fellow Americans, 1 week ago, half a world away, our nation was faced by the challenge of deliberate and unprovoked acts of aggression in Southeast Asia. Within 24 hours, the resolution before me now had been placed before each house of Congress. In each house, there followed free and serious debate. In each house, the resolution was passed on Friday last, with a total of 502 votes in support and 2 opposed. I now sign this resolution. Come on, we're working left. get up in the house, Charlie? Bob, secretary? Thank you. Now, would you get it? Dan, take this in the little car. Thank you, Sam.
Well, why do you suppose the North Vietnamese made these attacks?
Sir, I cannot answer that. I am no good at reading minds in English, and in trying to read them in the language of the North Vietnamese or the Tonkinese would be completely beyond my ken.
I can't explain them. They were unprovoked, as I told you last night.
Now, governments lie, but they don't like to lie literally, because a literal, flat, and obvious lie tends to be caught up. So what they do is they become the masters of the disingenuous statement, of phrasing something in such a way that the honest and normal and unwary reader gets one impression that he's supposed to get. And then 3 months later, he discovers it's not true, and he goes back to complain. They say, well, that isn't what we said. Look at it carefully. You look at it carefully, and sure enough, it was really double talk. It didn't say exactly what they said.
So that's what we're showing or taking some sort of action against North Vietnam in this area approximately this time.
No, to the best of my knowledge, there were no operations during the period I was describing last night.
Yeah,
I'm from there, so during the period I was describing last night.
Yeah.
I.F. Stone is a good example of this because he took apart the Pentagon in many ways by simply reading material that was available to all of us. Now, if somebody came in and said to you, well, why don't you start by reading these hearings and then give me a report on the deductions you can make, and then we'll see where we can go from there, that's the kind of thing I'm talking about. Now, I don't think it'll ever happen because of what we're talking about. The fact that that newspapers in this country, as presently constituted, depend upon large economic interests for their money, and they pay our salaries, and we know it.
Air Vice Marshal Key is a dynamic man. At 34, said to be one of the best public speakers in Vietnam. He gets to work around 7:30 in the morning, works late at night. He has broken the habits of siestas. There is none here, and he doesn't even go out to lunch, but like an American businessman, he eats off the corner of his desk. He is a hero to the Vietnamese people. We had an opportunity to talk to him today.
We need more American troops or allied troops.
We are wearing these flak vests that will protect us against small stuff, I guess.
That's correct. This will stop a .30 caliber slug, which is normally about what we get shot at us, and they have saved a few lives, so we wear them all the time. However, in this airplane, we may or may not be wearing a parachute. It'll be up to you. I personally don't wear one, so...
Well, it's no sense in my going out in that jungle if you're not going to be down there with me.
Walter, right here, we're now approaching or coming over the area where the B-52 strikes were put in.
You think of the crooks, and the guys that run the bars and live off the bar girls, and the smart wives of the generals that run the bawdy houses in Vietnam. Our allies are a pretty stinking crowd. And you think of these people very ill-prepared in the jungle under our B-52s, anti-personnel, all these nice antiseptic words we have, and think of what they've done, what they've fought. You know, we ought to be glad about it. We ought to be glad about it. Because you know what they've done? They've reestablished the primacy of man in an age of technology. And you know, the Vietnam War has been a terrible defeat for all the brand names we believe in, for General Electric and General Motors and AT&T, for all the great corporations, all the great industry that do the push buttons and know how to, and when they turn to war, they know how to kill people en masse. And they failed. And it's really very hard for us to take it. It does something to it. We're people that believe in technology and technological and the ability to solve any problem by technological means. And here down in the jungle, way below, is a strange creature that we can't crush. This strange animal we can't kill. It's time to look closely at it and see, by God, it's a human being. And isn't that wonderful that human beings can resist all this murderous technology of ours?
New York, 1971. I.F. Stone wins the Polk Award. So does Walter Cronkite for the CBS documentary, The Selling of the Pentagon.
Listen, that job you guys did at the Pentagon was just beautiful. And you know, to have the objectivity to take a slam at yourself, that son of a bitch Agnew ought to give you credit for that.
Yeah.
That's a hell of a guy. Did you know?
I must say that I would just assume that we could find some other way around that problem. But I understand that.
Well, it was a real testimony of the TV coverage on the war, especially CBS. We just didn't work.
You get up here very often?
Well, fairly often. No.
When you have time, why don't you give me a call?
Mr. Gallagher.
It is a journalist's task to be clear, cool, and objective, bringing some reason to our time. I said objective, not official. Objective, not activist, as desired by some. There are enough activist voices now without journalists adding theirs and destroying public confidence in the profession. Quibbling, equivocating, cavelling critics claim it is impossible for the journalist to be objective. The refuge of the journalist amid this torrent of criticism is his professionalism. How well does he do his job, and how impartially? If he does it well, he can defend himself, and that is all that is needed.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gallagher. You have given us great instruction and a powerful reminder of our responsibility and stature as journalists and a profession. We have to remember your words.
Mr. Stone. I.F. Stone is most certainly a direct descendant of America's earliest editors. We may appreciatively recall Franklin, Adams, Greeley, McClure, and Mencken. We do have I.F. Stone. We prize him, for his type is now scarce indeed.
I'm very happy to receive my first establishment award. I want to say one word about George Polk, who seems to be forgotten at these affairs. I knew George very well, met him in Cairo on a number of trips after the war. He was a wonderful young man, a wonderful young man. And he was the first journalistic victim of the Cold War. I noticed the antiseptic reference to him being killed on his way to interview an insurgent leader. The fact is that Greece was our first Vietnam, the first exercise of the Pax Americana. And the crushing of the revolt then stands in lineal relationship to the present dictatorship. George Polk was one of those few American journalists who was not afraid to see beyond the murk of the Cold War to the agony and struggle of the Greek people. And he was murdered. He was the Z. He was the Z of the 40s, murdered by the Greek police, who tried to frame the murder and blame the left on it, although George was one of the only friends the left had. One of these days, somebody ought to do the story of George Polk in all its implications and its relationship to the agony of Greece under our imperialist oppression. Thank you.
He was born 1907 in Philadelphia and grew up in Haddonfield, New Jersey. His parents were Russian immigrants, his father a merchant and realtor. But the eldest son wanted none of that. He would be a newspaper man. At the age of 14, he started his first, The Progress, which lasted 3 issues before he was forced back to his schoolwork. He worked nights on local papers during high school and quit the University of Pennsylvania after 3 years for the newsroom of the Camden Courier. He spent the 30s as editorial writer for the New York Post and moved to Washington as correspondent for The Nation in 1940. Soon he was writing special assignments for PM, the New York daily, which carried no advertising, attracted many of the best journalists of the day, and stirred things up in New York until the money ran out in the late 40s.
Again, we have a known associate and collaborator with communists and pro-communists.
I am not and never have been a communist. I am not and never have been a fellow traveler.
As the political climate in the United States shifted rightward and the circulation of the liberal press dwindled, Stone clung to his maverick ways. He stood almost alone in defending victims of the loyalty inquisitions
There is not a communist zone
and
in
produced The Hidden History of the Korean War, an angry and intricate analysis of the tactics and diplomacy of that conflict. The last of PM's successors closed down Election Day 1952, leaving I.F. Stone unemployed and unemployable. He was 44 years old, with a family of 4, almost no savings.
So anyway, I decided I would start my own little paper. You know, when I started out, I had 2 disadvantages, one physical and one political. The physical disadvantage was that in about 1937, I went to a doctor and he told me I was going deaf. And for a long time I was deaf. As a result, I couldn't go to hearings. And I got the habit of going around the next morning and reading the transcript for myself. And I soon discovered that the next day, and read it for yourself, you always found things the reporters had missed because you were brighter, but because it's very hard to sit there all day and listen to a lot of chit-all. And secondly, since I was starting in a very hostile atmosphere, and people didn't believe what I was saying, and I had no inside information, and if I did have, nobody would believe it, I had to present my material in a form that was documented from the government's own sources.
That was 1953. He came in off the street and was printing this little weekly newspaper. I believe he was printing at the time 7,000 copies. And I wanted to know if we could handle it. He said, at that time he didn't tell us that he'd been to 7 other printers. But apparently he'd been fired by all 7 or he couldn't get along. And he came to us and asked us if we would be interested in doing it and what the cost would be and so forth. And we figured it up, started out then, and been dealing together ever since. And, well, we've had a few fights over 17 years, but he himself told us that we had to get after him because he would get out of line, make a lot of unnecessary changes, and, well, he had a little temper, too, with it, and I'd tell him he'd have to straighten out and not make so many changes. And he'd get a little mad, and then he'd straighten out again, so it worked out all right.
Let's start off with driving up on top.
Through old subscription lists, he was able to find just enough readers to start. His friends privately considered the venture doomed to failure, but Stone was full of optimism. Keep the first issue, he counseled readers. One day, it will be a collector's item. He rented an office near Capitol Hill, but gave it up after 2 years had passed with hardly a visitor or a phone call. In those days, he wasn't even allowed into Washington's National Press Club. In 1941, he had taken a Negro judge to lunch there, and the waiters refused to serve them. Unsupported by club members, he resigned. Efforts by his friends over the years to have him reinstated have failed, and he remains barred to this day.
He'd come in, as you know, he was weekly then, and he'd run in every week and call it, set it, and then back when we first started, why, we both might be working on it. There were times that I actually printed on the presses, even though that's not my job. And we were just too busy to pay that much attention to him. We did the job. There's one thing, you know, he was the greatest for paying. He had to pay almost immediately. And I don't even know then if he really could afford it because the circulation was so small.
Hello? Yeah. $5 a year. $5 a year. No, it's bi-weekly, every other week. No, we don't have a billing organization. Just send it in with your name, address, and zip code.
No, he's never looked at subscription lists. He doesn't have the time.
Esther Stone, the weekly circulation manager.
His time, his energies go into his research and his writing. If he had to stop to think about building or failing, it just never would have worked. Simply not that kind of a person, and he wouldn't have been able to do it.
Subscription address.
Well, if you just put Washington, D.C., it'll get to me. FBI won't.
There was no what went on here. deterred my husband from doing writing as he pleased. He has always
I'm
done.
the bi-weekly's most eminent errand boy, as you can see.
Yeah, he's going out to mail.
People call me an investigative reporter. I'm not really concerned with exposing or investigation. I've done some of that. What I've really been trying very hard, it's nothing sensational, and it's hard to put in a headline, is to understand more thoroughly and to help others to understand. And to express it with some grace and with some effort at beauty. I've always dreamt of an issue that'll be like a souffle, erudite and urbane and witty and graceful. Take all the junk of the news and make it sing, make poetry out of it. Yes, thank you. I told my wife years ago, I said, honey, I'm going to graduate from a pariah to a character, and then if I last long enough, I'll be regarded as a national institution. I say, why, of course, it's a free cook. Look at Izzy Stone. I ran into David Levine yesterday at the party. He was afraid to see it. He thought I might be mad at him for that caricature. I said, no. I said, you really caught beautifully that combination of maniacal zest and idiot zeal.
Stone counted himself lucky to find 5,300 people unafraid to subscribe to a radical paper.
The United Nations in New York takes up the Korean question. Our new ambassador, Henry Cabot.
He quickly enraged many of them by supporting the newly elected President Eisenhower.
Wyszynski then puts on his usual maniacal performance, and after a series of propagandistic lies, offers a proposal.
Ike, he said, would end the Korean War.
And all the Joint Chiefs of Staff come in with all that brass and all those stars, and it's no joke. You're the president. You're responsible for the country's safety. And these guys have spent a lifetime in the Navy, the Army, and the Air Force. You know, it's easy for us to laugh at them, but suppose you got the responsibility. And they say, Mr. President, we got to have Cameron Bay. We got to have this. We got to do this. How do you tell them they're full of crap? Now, Eisenhower had the great advantage, had one more star than they did. He was a very modest man, and he knew that they too were very modest men. None of them were geniuses.
My husband and I were charter subscribers, and we read it faithfully. For $5 a year, you got a clear view of the main subject.
In the early 50s, public records went out of business. The witch hunters had been successful. In fact, the witch hunters were so successful that the whole progressive movement went out of business. The only organ that I can recall during that period in which you could get an objective view of what really was going on in the world was this 4-page weekly of IZZY'S.
In the daily newspaper business, very often seems to me much too concerned about finding out what's going to happen tomorrow or what Ron Ziegler or somebody else is going to say the next day, rather than going over what's happening now and trying to explain what's happened in the last week or in the last year. Whereas Izzy goes back and he probes and he pries and he studies, and this incredible respect for knowledge and for truth. I think anybody that goes into what's known as investigative reporting, you can't help but be influenced by Izzy.
Hello? Yeah.
I am Peter Osnos, and I'm a reporter for the Washington Post now. And in 1965-66, I was Izzy Stone's assistant, and my tenure of 10 months ranks as among the longest times anybody has ever worked for him doing anything. And the reason is that he's one of the most difficult people that walks the face of the earth. It's a process of 7 days a week, 18 hours a day, just trying to keep up all the time. Generally it starts about 7:30 in the morning. Izzy's on the phone and he's Pete? And you're beginning to shake already. And he's already been through the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Baltimore Sun. At that point it was the New York Herald Tribune and the Wall Street Journal. And you're still struggling through the A section of the Washington Post, let alone the little table on the front of the second section of the New York Times. And the first thing he wants to know is if you saw the item on page Z12 in which J. Edgar Hoover was proven to be the fool we all know he is. And of course, if you've seen it, you're in heaven for the rest of the day. But if, God forbid, you missed it, you know, you just don't recover all day. And from then on in, it's just run, run, run until generally I would fall asleep usually about 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning with 3 or 4 congressional records stacked on my chest or under my chin. Gaga with the day's debate on some particularly boring subject that Izzy wanted indexed. And of course, you could never index it adequately because he could always index it infinitely faster. I mean, he could take an enormous volume of congressional hearings, and in the course of maybe what would seem to me 10 seconds, but was probably about 2 hours, he would leap through these things, you know, and come up with some jewel that other people would devote a lifetime to. Classic view of Izzy is picking up a newspaper, which he grabs at mid-scene and sort of tears in two. He's doing it constantly. I mean, he does it in elevators, in buses, just, you know. People read, but they miss most of what they see. Izzy misses nothing. I mean, the things that other people will just look over and they'll just say, mm-hmm. Izzy makes about 10 mental notes a minute. The second thing is his memory. He remembers things from 4 or 5 years, 6 years before, little tiny items. Another thing I think that underlies the genius is a sense of outrage. And somebody who's been looking at things for so long to still feel horrified by what's going on, which he does.
I want to deal, for example, with the biggest whopperoo of all in the April 7th speech. The president said, I left
Washington in January of 1961 after serving 8 years as vice president under President Eisenhower. There were no American combat forces in Vietnam. No Americans had died in combat in Vietnam. When I returned to Washington as president 8 years later, there were 540,000 American troops in Vietnam. 31,000 died.
Now, the truth is that if Richard Nixon had had his way, American boys would have begun to die in Vietnam 10 years earlier. He's always boasting about his travels. It's true that he's been to Vietnam many times. Every time he's gone there, he's tried to deepen our involvement. The first time he went there was late in 1953 when he rushed off to Hanoi, urging the French not to negotiate peace. In 1954, the same Nixon who represents himself as a man of peace, a pacifist, practically a man in a loincloth, Mahatma Nixon, declared that rather than let the French negotiate peace, we ought to put American boys, American combat troops in there.
I'm so deeply committed to peace.
In August '64, he called not only for American combat troops in South Vietnam, but for the liberation of the North, and all through the 60s. By the way, also, I want to tell you, Nixon praised Johnson for introducing gas warfare. In '67, he wanted the troops increased to 500,000. He said if we had 500,000 men in there, it would lower the casualties. I'm not joking, I'm not exaggerating, it's right there on the record. So this great escalator, the man that wanted to get in there a decade earlier, the man who wanted American boys to fight and die there earlier, the man who kept prodding, who praised Kennedy for going in, who prodded Johnson to go further and further into the morass, this man comes up and tells us that when he left office in 1961, there was no war and no American boys fighting, and when he got back 8 years later, there were 540,000 American boys and 31,000 dead. Really, what a bunch of idiots he must take us for. And I'm sorry to say that to some degree, his faith in our idiocy is not misplaced. In our anxiety to end this war, we focus too much upon the war itself. It's very important to make the people of this country understand why the war has happened and how it can happen again. Otherwise, we can get out of Vietnam and tomorrow we'll be in Thailand or in the Philippines or in Korea. The real enemies of this country, The real danger to our security is militarism and imperialism. I don't mean to imply that anybody sitting in the Pentagon is necessarily a monster or a plotter. These people are trapped by the institution they serve. But what I mean to say is that when a country has as big a military machine as we have, it's bound to get in one hell of a lot of trouble.
How do you get things that nobody else does? People ask me to ask you that.
My only friend in downtown Washington during the Cold War, the only guy that gave me a smile. Give me your full name, Dickie, so we get it straight.
Okay.
Give me your full name. Say it to the camera. Say it to the camera.
Frankie Nash, the only friend in town.
Right.
He stashes them in pockets and in these folders. He's got these big, at least he used to when I was there, big alphabetical folders, which he always means to file away. But of course, you know, they accumulate in such great degree and at such speed that he never does. And so then the trick becomes remembering what's in each one of these folders. Izzy thinks that Washington is the easiest place in the world to cover. This is what he told me when I first went to work for him. I want to know why. He said, well, look, he said, there's so many things going on. All you have to do is pick one. Well, from his standpoint, that's right. From somebody else's standpoint, you can get overwhelmed by so many things going on. You can't see the forest for the trees.
Accumulating information is not the same as intelligence. It requires absorption and integration and a frame of reference. And so they got warehouses full of information. They got so much here they don't know what the hell to do with it. It runs out of their ears. I'm sure we waste billions of dollars on it. I assure you that the Politburo can't give a belch without the National Security Administration registering it, because they have all these huge ears in Pakistan and Turkey on the border and satellites, and they collect everything.
Congress or the executive branch can't control it? I mean, there's...
Can't control it. Very hard to control a secret agency. It can't control itself. A thing like what's happening in Laos or Cambodia, I think CIA is behind this Cambodian stuff. But I wouldn't be surprised if the headquarters in Washington knew very little of what was going out in the field. The kind of guys that go in for that kind of work are screwy. They're screwy mentalities. They like the intrigue. And I'm sure they spy on each other, undercut each other. It's a hard thing to control. But you see, collect information. For example, they collect information from Cuba, a distant island, it's 100 miles away, speaking a strange language, Spanish, only known to 3 scholars, and they have agents all over the place. They couldn't figure out what was going on. A government finds it very hard to absorb intelligence that runs counter to its own preconceptions. And if you're working for the CIA, and you turn in a report and say, look, Fidel Castro doing a good job, they think, this guy must be a pinko. Where'd we get him? Who recruited him? Let's check back on him. 17 guys that get fired up and down the chain for getting this guy in there. There are obvious things you can't see, because if you saw it, you wouldn't be on that side. The whole Vietnam business, the whole question, how do you win a war in a peasant country on the side of the landlords? How big a genius do you have to be? How many PhDs do you have to hire to answer that question? How do you win a war in a peasant country on the side of the landlords? It's so goddamn obvious. And we never saw it all these years. We still don't see it.
Our differences are over the best means to achieve just peace. As president, I have a responsibility to listen to those in this country who disagree with my policies. But I also have a solemn obligation to make the hard decisions which I find are necessary to protect the lives of 400,000 American men remaining in Vietnam.
Tuesday, after the weekly had gone to press, the editor would settle down for a leisurely lunch with friends. On this day, he's meeting Ralph Ingersoll, the publisher of PM during the 1940s.
Hey, that's a good phrase for it. Passive objectivity. Instead of this anemic pseudo-objectivity, which is considered objective, they just parrot every damn thing the government says in the party line. That's objectivity.
The whole thing is how it's in one.
Ingersoll has just returned from a trip to Laos, where he arrived the day of the Allied incursion in February 1971.
I got off the plane, and the AP people and my son-in-law told me that the town was full of these rumors. So I went over to see Gene McMurtry Godley as the American ambassador there, and who immediately denied everything. And I went in and had a formal interview, and he started his conversation with saying, Ingersoll, he said, there's one thing about this war that's wrong, and that's the press. He said, there are a lot of Richard Harding Davises. They're always trying to make reputations for themselves. They won't play ball. This was the great phrase, play balls. They won't play ball. He takes me into his office, and nearly as large as this restaurant, with 3 walls, are war maps. And then he tells me that he drops every bomb in Laos personally. Every bomb direction goes over his desk. Put this the U.S. ambassador, not a military man, or an ACO man or anything else, and loved it, and began to speak of it in the first person. I got 53 trucks yesterday. To which I answered sarcastically, well, that must have stopped them. And he said, no, so that's the trouble. There were more trucks on the road the next day. You don't know what these Russians are doing with those trucks. This went on and on. He said, well, now all this nonsense about the CIA operating here. He said, now I'll tell you. We went to Hotchkiss, the same school, the same college, and he's a member of a club of mine, the Bruck club here. He said, I'll tell you, there are 206 CIA men. And I'll show you where they are. And I'll tell you the troops that they're directing, the Neo troops for Laos. And if you print one word of that, you're a goddamn liar. The press people talking to me there say, particularly the Associated Press, which is the basis for American news coming out of there, we have an American official or the official of a foreign government who gives us a statement. And we know it's a damn lie. But we're the Associated Press, and he's an official of the government. We have to put that on the wire. And we have no mechanism by which we can qualify that statement or explain it. Now, we can come along 2 or 3 later and write a story in depth that follows this. They may not even move it on the line from New York. If they do move it, what paper's going to pick it up? Just take the subject of the CIA man now. When the ambassador says, I'll call you a damn liar if you print this, and you printed it, where are you then?
Well, being very pragmatic for a minute, in our present society, what do you think that we as the younger generation or the youth of today can do to change our society?
Do what you're doing, holler.
Do you think that's the only way?
Huh?
Do you think that's the only way to go out in the streets and holler, or can it be done another way?
Yeah.
I.F. Stone's bi-weekly, another strident voice of illiberalism, commented, "The race is on between protest and disaster. The only hope is that the students can create such a plague for peace, swarming like locusts in the halls of Congress, that they stop all other business and make an end to the war the #1 concern it ought to be."
I.F. Stone. The best thing about this year's demonstration is you fellows. You're the one new note and the one hope of making an impress on the country. I remember very vividly as a young newspaper man in 1932 when Herbert Hoover called out General MacArthur and the troops and drove the bonus marchers out of Washington and burned down their tents. It was the biggest mistake Herbert Hoover ever made. And if they drive you out tonight, it'll be the biggest mistake Richard Nixon ever made.
In the 20s, through Jack London and Herbert Spencer, I got the Kropotkin. I forget just exactly how. But I became converted to communist anarchism, which seemed to me the most beautiful society, and a communism without coercion. And I gradually worked my way back to being a counter-revolutionary, as I suppose I am today. You know, the fact that you're frustrated doesn't give you a right to. You know, a child falls down on the floor and beats its head on the floor when it's frustrated. It doesn't make a revolutionary movement. It has to be. Some way, just like you're working off your frustration with your parents in a political way, and it may be therapeutic, but is it politics? I mean, you've got a. How do you make a revolution in a country where 4/5 of the people are satisfied? You know, in the days of the New Deal, Roosevelt would say the country was 1/3 ill-clothed, ill-fed, ill-housed. Now it's 1/5. Well, that's some progress. How do you make a revolution when part of the movement are middle-class kids, dissatisfied with affluence, with great justice, looking for something different, and half of it are poor kids who want affluence? This is a problem all over the world. I don't know what the answer to it is. I mean, something happened between 1905 and 1970 besides the Vietnam War. You want to be a revolutionary and change society, you've got to study what happened before. I mean, Lenin and Trotsky studied the French Revolution. The French revolutionaries studied the English Revolution. The founders of the Constitution studied the Greek and Roman Revolution. And they really studied it. It's in the Constitution. It's in the Federalist Papers. Real knowledge. Real absorption and distillation of human political experience. Talk about power to the people. If people ever came into power, we'd all be in jail.
The assembly will now be in order.
Amherst, 1970. I.F. Stone receives his first honorary degree.
Oh, no. He's still Mr. Stone.
Oh, yes.
He won't change one
Same
bit.
as always.
Still a college dropout.
You know, it's very hard to walk around the streets of Amherst early in the morning, as I did this morning. It's such a beautiful town. And it's very hard for us to realize what our war has done to other peoples, to their peaceful villages, to their quiet lives, to their ancient traditions and mores.
Isidor Feinstein Stone. I.F. Stone. Your contributions to American society, American life, and American policy have been large. You are fearless, and you are a teacher who makes available what can be discovered. You are a scholar who discovers new relationships, makes new conclusions, and prevents fresh ways of looking at old problems. You have refused to be swept under any rug, and are yourself a master at rolling back the rugs of sham, deceit, and stupidity. Amherst College salutes you, and by virtue of the authority vested in me by the Board of Trustees, I confer upon the degree of Doctor of Humane Letters with all the rights and privileges of the time.
At age 64, the strain has become too much. He closes down the weekly to concentrate on longer pieces for the New York Review of Books. In December 1971, he has come to his printer's plant for the last time.
Yes. Please. I want to say goodbye. Yeah. It's so long. Never say goodbye.
Let's see, sir.
Goodbye, Mrs. Stone.
And I tell you, I really have so much fun, I ought to be arrested. It really, sometimes I think it's really wrong of me because, you know, if you're a newspaper, as I've been since I was 14 years old, to have your own little paper, it may be very small, as Daniel Webster said about Dartmouth, it may be a small college, but there are those who love it. To be able to spit in their eye and do what you think is right and report the news and have enough readers to make some impact is such a pleasure that you forget what you're writing about. It becomes, you know, it's like you're like a journalistic Nero fiddling while Rome burns and having a hell of a good time, or like a small boy covering a hell of a big fire. It's just wonderful and exciting, and you're a cub reporter, and God has given you a big fire to cover, and you forget that it's really burning.